Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for September 13th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today I'm joined on the couch by Stan Nurilov. Nice to have you back on the show, Stan. How's it going?
Thank you. Nice to be back. I'm doing well. How are you, John?
All right, and I know you've got an interesting story that ties in with a lot of the malware reverse engineering you do
yes.
for the show today, okay?
Can't wait to talk
And also on the couch we have Matt Kaiser.
How's it
Hey,
going?
Matt, how's it going? A lot of stories from you as well, which we're going to jump into momentarily. And I'm John Hogoboom. Thanks for joining the show. And let's jump into the first story, which is one that you're looking at, Matt, regarding vDOS operators. And I guess there was some kind of, well, why don't you just tell me all about it?
All right, so those of us who watch the show a lot know we like reading stories from Krebs on security, and he has a real kicker this week. The database from a popular booter stressor DDoS service called vDOS was leaked, and the operators, or at least the alleged operators, have been arrested in Israel. So the interesting thing about it is that these guys have been running this for about 2 years, and from the limited database dump that he got, which is about a time frame, I want to say, from March 2016 to July 2016.
So a few months.
A couple of months.
Right.
If the data is correct, it sounds like they made about $600,000 in that month alone, in that section of time alone.
Oh, really?
The service had been operating since 2012. So if you extrapolate back, it's a significant amount of money being made by this service. Now, this is one of those services that claims to be a legitimate stressor tool, only use it on your own website. But the database shows that most users were not doing that. They were using it to attack other people. I've actually poked around in the database itself, which has been released, so you can see who attacked who, when, with what kind of traffic. And it's interesting, the handles that are being used, like the logins for the site, you Google a couple of these guys and you realize that they consider themselves, pro gamers types, people who, have a reason to cheat at online gaming and potentially DDoS their opponents in an attempt to get an edge.
Right.
So I found that really interesting. Krebs estimates that the amount of traffic that's been sent from this service has been about 8.81, what he calls DDoS years of traffic. So you take a certain duration of the attack, you multiply it by the number of participants in said attack to get the total DDoS length of time of the attack. So 8.81 years, it hasn't been around for 8.81 years, but enough bots are part of the network and enough time has been spent attacking that you could say, if you put it all end to end, that much time. And that's, again, only for the time period that was in the leak. So there's probably a considerable amount more.
Was that 8 years just for the 2 or 3 months of data they had?
Yes.
Or are they extrapolating to say since 2012?
I believe that was just for that time period, which is, again, significant. So there's actually 2 stories on Krebs for this one. First was the release of the database and Krebs doing a little bit of his own doxing, pointing to clues that suggested these 2 people from Israel were behind the attacks, and now these folks have been arrested. It turns out that the Poodle stressor had apparently been using this system as the basis for their service. So sort of almost like a reseller agreement where all of their requests would be funneled through the API to vDOS, and vDOS would actually implement the attack. There's suggestions that Shenron, which is also associated with Lizard Squad, was doing the same kind of thing. One interesting thing to come out of this, which I think I'd like to discuss with you guys and get your take on, is that one of the final victims of this service before it was shut down, took an interesting action. They were under attack, and they decided in order to reroute that traffic, they were actually going to perform BGP hijacking and change the routes to and from that network so that traffic would not reach them.
So they were announcing routes?
Yes, the victims decided as a last-ditch effort to announce routes, and it's been somewhat controversial. I wanted to know what you would think. If you were a network admin and you were placed in that situation, do you think it's...
Well, I guess it depends, and I'd like to understand how they implemented that more. If it was, if it's a large network that they have of their own, like they're an ISP or something, and they're internally announcing, like black holing that route, that would be one thing, as long as they don't announce it out to the internet to say that, hey, in order to get to this, to or from this BGP ASN, you're going to go through us. That would really be hijacking. But if they're just saying, I'm kind of black holing this within my own network, or my larger network, then I wouldn't think that that's a problem. because you're not leaking it out to the rest of the internet to say that I'm redirecting everybody else's traffic that's outside of me into me so I can inspect it. Do you know what they were doing exactly?
So I've seen postings on Nanog, which is a North American network operators group.
Right.
And if it made it to Nanog, I doubt that it was internal only. I believe that they were actually
So other people
doing
probably
real
observed that they were bleeding out
those routes
somehow. Interesting.
I mean, it's an interesting tactic. I can't say that I would say it's appropriate for everybody to use, but like you said, there are situations in which you can do it internally to get some sort of advantage. So.
Yeah, and there actually is. I wish I could remember the name of them. There is kind of a group of people, like a community that started up to kind of share routing information that's of the same nature to BGP black hole, like bad actors as a community, but you only do it within your own respect. So you basically get like a BGP black hole list. I forget the name of the group that's been working on this. There's a bunch of large ISPs are participating in that grouping, but it's a little bit different than what you're saying. It's more, in my own internal network, I'm saying that this is no good. I don't want to go there anymore, which helps, mitigate, especially if one provider's seeing it and they see that we're getting to DDoS and they're highly reliable and trusted, and then the other providers kind of follow suit. It can really kind of quiesce all that traffic across the internet, especially if you get a lot of tier 1 ISPs involved. They're not doing anything to like hijack routes necessarily. You're only doing it within your own network, which kind of can stop it from being a problem elsewhere, especially if it's within your own network. So interesting story. And I'd like to find out more about exactly what they were doing with that defensive BGP hijacking, because that sounds a little fishy to me, that they would even be able to do that, because it depends on how your trust relationship is set up with your next, whoever you peer out with. So that's kind of interesting that they would allow that. All right, so let's move on to the next story, which is also one that you're looking at, Matt. And I don't really know much about this one, so I'm going to let you fill me in. But House of Keys and some 9 months later kind of follow up on this one?
Sure. So there's a group called SEC Consult, and about 9 months ago they did the recent research showing that a number of IoT devices were reusing the same cryptographic certificates and keys across the board. So say if I produce a particular model of router, the problem is that if you manufacture that router and you put the same keys on all of them, anybody who goes and investigates the firmware for that router can pull out those keys and then use those keys to inspect the traffic or to impersonate the device.
So is this the HTTPS, or is it
It's
like the
HTTPS, SSH, all of these things. Imagine the same config. The root problem is probably that the config is the same for most of these devices.
Right.
But then it applies to things like secret keys.
Right.
So they did this research about 9 months ago. They did a follow-up in the last week. Stefan Wiebek, I hope I'm saying that right, did more research and found that there was an increase in the number of devices doing this, actually increased by 40%, despite the fact that they had put out this alert and let people know that this is a problem.
Right, so even though he made people aware that, hey, you're all reusing the same keys across all these devices, people just kept doing it anyway.
Right. So manufacturers are still
continuing to be a problem.
Exactly.
Right.
So the number is now up to 4.5 million individual devices that they've discovered through their scanning that are sharing these. And it's fairly simple. You can connect over SSH or HTTPS, and as part of that handshake, the certificate information is provided to you. And then you can just take a look at the fingerprint and say, I know that this is this unique, certificate or key, and then you can start building a list of who has what.
So really you would still have to be in the middle of a conversation in order to intercept the traffic and then be able to decode it.
True.
Which is not trivial necessarily, depending on where where you're sitting relative to that traffic happening. But I guess what's the other, is there another angle here?
Well, you can also impersonate. If you have those secret keys, you can install them and listen. And if someone is expecting to be talking to a particular device and they've already said, well, say I'm using PuTTY and I've already connected to this SSH server once and I have this fingerprint from the key.
Right, you're not going to get a warning or anything.
Right, exactly. So it has some implications. So they've released the updated data on GitHub. Their recommendations at the end of the article are particularly interesting. They have recommendations for device manufacturers, ISPs, and users. different things you can do to improve the situation. Obviously, for manufacturers, anytime you generate keys for, anytime you push firmware to a device, you could generate a brand new key and push it to each one, just so that it's, they might be self-signed, they might be signed for real with a whole chain of trust. I'm forgetting the right word for it, but do something different so that it's not as trivial for someone to perform these attacks.
But then, as we know, if they're going to push firmware, not that, first of all, who updates their router, right? As we found out, a lot of people aren't doing it, which I recommend you do, but a lot of people don't. But then when you do, if you're going to regenerate keys, now when you go to connect to it, it's going to give you that warning. It says, hey, this is not the right key anymore. And you're going to be like, oh, no,
well, hopefully you'll have that response. Well, the other side of it as well, the ISP section was things like if you have some sort of remote interface that allows someone to log in remotely and administer the device, there are things they're suggesting, like putting that on a separate VLAN. So if you're like a cable modem company or a cable provider, make sure that only the hosts that need to talk to that administrative interface can talk to that administrative interface.
Right.
The last section is for users, and the suggestions are, if you can, change these keys. But they fully admit that most users will, one, never read this research, and if they do, two, they may not even have the ability to change those keys. Because like we know, IoT devices, you'll flash the firmware, but you may not have a really good way of updating the base config, because unpacking a firmware and modifying it and repacking it takes a little bit of knowledge as well.
Right.
So the suggestions may be out of the range of the common user, but they are correct suggestions.
Yes, I would agree. So it is correct. Also, I don't know that this is like, to me, it's not like I'm just going to be able to get into this router. Well, first of all, we already know that there's a lot of these devices out there, because we talk about it all the time, these IoT-based devices that have all these, like you're saying, certificates that are the same, SSH keys that are the same. But the bigger problem is people are putting them out on the network, attaching to the internet. They're not changing the passwords to something other than the default one, provided by the vendor. They're not updating the devices. This kind of thing, are they actually going to, if they're already not doing some of the real basic level of security to protect their device, I'd be a little skeptical that a lot of people are going to take advantage of, this guy's research. Not to say it's not valid research, it is. But it also, like I said, you would need to be in the middle of the conversation to really take advantage of this. Basically, what he's discovered is he's turned all of this encrypted traffic into basically ClearNet. So SSH has become Telnet, and HTTPS has become HTTP at this point. So they're basically not really doing much for somebody who could be in the middle of that conversation. Which, if you're a rogue proxy server or something like that, you could.
Or say you're the edge of a country that has a great firewall.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right. But then I guess we're probably digressing a little bit too much. Are you going to cross country boundaries when you're trying to manage your own router or whatnot? Usually a lot of these devices are managed within the country that they're in. Usually, you would think. But people expose them on the internet all the time. So something to be aware of. Nevertheless, it is valid. And we know that there's tons of these devices out there. We're going to talk about it in the internet weather, which we do every week anyway. But it's a very frustrating problem, in my opinion, because as much as we talk about this and other security people talk about this type of stuff, it doesn't seem like anybody else is listening except the security guys. So anyway, let's move along on that down note. Maybe Stan can energize us with some of this other stuff related to IDA Pro. So there's some actor set figured out a way to prevent you from reverse engineering their code.
They make it a little bit more challenging, I would say. So it's a great article by Palo Alto, Unit 42. So in their blog, they discovered something interesting. So I love these kinds of stories, by the way, because this is near and dear to my heart. I always think of if I was a bad guy, what would I do? And this is one of those interesting bad guy techniques that they used. So you may know that every DLL, it has this functionality that it exposes.
Right.
And it names those functions something, like do print or message box or something like that. And for a programmer, that's how they know the functionality delivered by DLL. And so DLLs have that or numbers. So for the functions, they have ordinals or function names. So the bad guys were like, hey, what if we just blank out the function names, I guess? What would happen? And so when you look at it at a DLL, then you just won't see the names of the functions. So that, first of all, that kind of hurts you in being able to like figure out what the purpose of the function of the function is, yeah. Because usually the name gives it away, generally, not always. And then the other thing is in IDA Pro, apparently, if you load up a DLL where the functions were blanked out this way, in one of the tabs or one of the views, you wouldn't see the exported function list. They wouldn't appear in that view.
So that was a bug in IDA Pro.
So that was a bug in IDA Pro, and it was interesting.
Just for other people's reference, if you're not familiar, IDA Pro is like a software utility to help you reverse engineer executables. So you can take a binary compiled executable and reverse engineer it back to something that you can maybe understand a little bit better as real code.
Exactly.
Because some people might not know that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, because this is something I kind of live and use all the time.
You're always in there, week after week.
Exactly. So good point, John. So basically, I thought it was a clever trick. It won't stop you from using IDA Pro because you'd still be able. There's other views where you could have seen the information or used it. It was one of those clever techniques. Now they went back and they were like, well, how did the bad guys come up with this? Did they do like some sort of like IDA Pro research, or did they, I don't think they can answer this question, like what were the bad guys thinking? But they went to the release notes of IDA Pro and they noticed that in version like A, whatever, they had this bug, and version B, it was fixed. So they looked at the date of when that was released, and the date when the malware was observed was 2 days later. So they're thinking, hey, maybe...
So they're paying attention to what bugs are being patched in IDA Pro.
Exactly.
So that they could take advantage of... And this was not just your typical malware type of author. This was a nation-state actor.
Malware that they associated with an APT threat actor. In this case, they call them the Dukes, APT-29, I think, Cozy Bear. These are all the names associated with this threat actor group. But anybody could have come up with that. Actually, as I was reading this, I was thinking back to my days as a Padawan in information security. And
do you want to explain what a Padawan is?
I'll let you. I'll let the users look that up. So basically, when I was just starting out in information security, I was very interested in reverse engineering, things like that. So one of my side projects was to actually take a DLL and figure out, what are the export sections, what are the function names and stuff like that. And I remember thinking, I'm like, what if they were blank? How would I handle that case? So it's interesting now to see that somebody else.
Can you actually have functions that all have the same name of blank? Even though they have different ordinal values?
Yeah, I'm not sure. That would be an interesting test case to run. I think you also don't have to define a name. So the name doesn't even have to exist as long as there's an ordinal number that you export. And that's what these guys were doing. Okay. So you can even have functions in your DLL that are not exposed, that if you knew where they were, you could load them up. But the system that's in the DLL for exporting them just makes it easier to write programs to call the functionality.
Right.
So like Windows will handle all that for you. I know it's getting too technical.
No, that's okay. No, that makes sense.
So basically, what I thought was interesting from this is, the bad guys, they're always paying attention, just as the good guys are, right? Just as we have to always stay up to date, and we always have to pay attention to all the news and security events, the bad guys are also paying attention. And we kind of have to know what they're doing. And also, I thought it was interesting that they were able to so quickly take action. They saw this release notes. 2 days later, they're already using malware that's kind of using this technique. Now, it is very specific to IDA Pro. Like other tools were probably not having this problem, or would exhibit different behaviors. It probably has to do with the tool, but it's interesting. It's an interesting observation. It also reminded me of, again, when I was just starting out, Halvar Flake. He's like the guy who is just the man at reverse engineering and using IDA Pro and just understanding like binary and x86. So they had a little competition. He put together a little HackMe file. So HackMe is like just for educational purposes. It's a computer program. You try to reverse engineer, see how it works. So apparently he created one that if you loaded it up in IDA Pro, it would actually crash IDA Pro. Okay. So that was like, he was so advanced in knowing how IDA Pro works that just loading the file would crash it. And so as defenders...
At least it wasn't a remote code execution
type
bug, right?
But it could have been.
Could have been, right? Which would be kind of scary, right?
Yeah, and you always have to be careful with that. So that's why as defenders, we always have to pay attention to that. And we also have to keep our tools up to date, and we have to take precautions, because the analysis tools themselves can become a vector of infection, depending on the malware you're loading. You're already dealing with code that's trying to do something malicious. And stuff like this always reminds me of that FireEye article from like maybe a few months ago, where how the FireEye devices work. If you recall, they just passively tap and execute malware in a sandbox. Well, they had a technique, I guess these bad guys, that they would send a specific malware binary that the FireEye would try to run in the sandbox, and the malware would be able to like escape the sandbox and get itself in the whitelist or something like that. So that class of bugs is very interesting to me, where you're attacking the defense mechanisms themselves. So this is just one of those.
Well, it also reminds me, I think you had another sample you had looked at maybe last year or something, where it, what did it do? Like disable the network interface?
Yes.
So when the malware analysis, like you're running this sample in a malware analysis environment, and it disconnected the network interface. So I think something happened there where it like stopped the processing or something, right?
Yeah, I think the way Cuckoo works, which is one of the sandbox that was impacted by this, is it collects telemetry on the malware, how it's working. And at the time, I think Cuckoo worked by opening up a network socket to some kind of reporting server and sending all this telemetry there. Well, the malware would run and would shut down the network interface card and then restart it a few seconds later. But by doing that, it would disconnect the reporting framework from the telemetry gathering program. And so basically your analysis would fail, your automated analysis, and you wouldn't know, like, oh, so I don't know what happened.
You'd just be like, oh, whatever.
What
information.
What was interesting about that is how it presented itself in the sandbox results. And you never usually see this. It's like, oh, it's an error. Why would there be an error in the sandbox? I've never, so it's pretty unique to see that.
But again, I wonder, not that we know, but that was an interesting technique where I wonder if whoever made their malware do that, if they realized we're doing this intentionally because we know it breaks some of these automated malware analysis environments.
They would almost have to for that one. And what was interesting about that malware sample is that it was very simple. So in terms of reverse engineering it was not that difficult. There were not too many obfuscation techniques. You could have just easily loaded that one up into, let's say, IDA Pro and seen a lot of the functionality very quickly. And once you knew where to look, you didn't even have to load it up into IDA Pro anymore. You could have just extracted what you needed from the samples. So it was interesting to me that they used that technique specific to like dynamic sandbox environments and things like that. So yeah, I think they knew what they were dealing with, but they didn't take all the possible precautions they could have in that case.
Yes, they need to do that. Plus, they need to have function names in their DLLs that are just blanks.
Plus, they need to obfuscate it and pack it and everything away. I don't think we're giving away too many secrets.
Anyway, interesting story. I mean, like you said, the tools that a lot of the security analyst type engineers use to help analyze this type of stuff, they are not without, these bad actors know that this is what people are going to go to when they're going to try to figure out how did their sample work. So it's something to consider, especially the ones that worry me most. So like IDA Pro, things like that, where even Wireshark. I know there have been some buffer overflows for Wireshark, so it makes me a little like nervous sometimes. You think that you're just opening something up that's a read-only or it's static. It's not going to actually do anything. But you might be able to get some kind of buffer overflow occur, just like any other application, that somebody writes. So good story, thanks. So next story up, snagging creds from locked machines. This is one you were looking at, Matt?
This is
Sounds
cool.
interesting.
I kind of like the hacks that you can bring a device and use the physical device for whatever you're doing. Laptops are all right, but pulling something out of your pocket and using it like a tool is always been kind of cool to me. So Rob Fuller, also known as Mubix, came up with this attack. It's a combination of a couple other ideas. But the general idea is you take one of two devices, the LAN turtle, which I think is a Hack5 special device. It behaves like an Ethernet adapter. So a USB to Ethernet adapter, but it's also running its own network stuff. So instead of just being an adapter, it's got a little server on there, and you can do some cool stuff with it.
Also, so like if you could actually talk to whatever the little server is over the network.
Right.
So it's like, it's all built in. That's interesting.
I think it's meant as a device you kind of leave behind, or like you plug it in and it looks like it's a USB to Ethernet adapter, but it's got more in it for certain attacks. But the other one they've done it with is the USB Armory, which is a really interesting little device, kind of expensive, but it's just a little USB stick that's programmable. You can run Linux on it. You can do a bunch of really cool stuff. And those are the two that he tested it on. And then someone else has said that you can do it with a Raspberry Pi Zero, and I'd like to try doing that one of these weekends. But let me get to the attack.
Okay.
The attack is you plug in a USB device, and the USB device tells the computer, I am a USB to Ethernet adapter. And because USB is plug and play, Windows will say, okay, great, let me just load the drivers for that and treat you like an Ethernet adapter. And most laptops, if you're using Wi-Fi and you plug in an Ethernet adapter of any kind, it says, great, that sounds like a better way to reach the internet. Let me start to send my traffic over the wired connection rather than the wireless one.
Most will automatically go to Ethernet if it's available.
Yep. Right. And the next thing it'll do is it'll try DHCP. Now, this device that you've created will run its own DHCP server, respond, and say, hey, by the way, you should probably be using this WPAD file, which is the Windows Auto Proxy configuration file, and say, this is where you need to go to get all your stuff on the network.
Right.
So then your laptop will say, great, let me keep doing that other stuff that I usually do. Start connecting to network shares, start talking to websites or logging into email, or all the traffic that was going over the Wi-Fi where your computer was locked will start going through here. And there's a software called Responder, which was developed specifically to listen on all these common ports and talk those languages.
That they're those types of services.
And accept any credentials sent to them and log them.
Okay.
Right. So just by plugging this device into the computer, you can potentially capture credentials for SMB, MS SQL, LDAP. LDAP's kind of a problem, right? And then it's also got listeners for FTP, POP3, and things like that. So you can capture a lot of credentials just by plugging something in. And
especially email, I could see, like right away, your email client is going to immediately flip over and start trying to talk to that.
Yep. The one I think that's probably most concerning is LDAP. Because usually if you're on a Windows domain, that's how you're going to be seeing those sort of credentials. Now, it doesn't crack them on the device, and usually these devices are somewhat slow, but it does save it off, so you can plug it in for a couple of seconds, unplug it, bring it home, and start cracking on whatever cracking software you've got.
And they're probably none the wiser, whoever's machine that was.
Yep.
Interesting.
So that's the attack, and I think it's pretty ingenious. In terms of defending against it, I think the only thing you could really do is set up some sort of policy or some sort of software that prevents plug-and-play devices when the laptop is locked. Or even in general, like if you've got a corporate deployment, you can say, I'm not going to accept any more USB devices except for the ones that I'm whitelisting specifically. You could do that. Now,
I think there was something. I think we covered a story about like signing USB devices or something. Like there was a way to just like you can sign code. I think somebody who's coming up with some standard to sign USB. Maybe it's in USB 3 or one of these new ones.
Oh, it might be. Yeah.
Where like maybe you could actually in your device say, I'm allowing these USB devices that are signed by this vendor or whatever. I don't know how that really protects you necessarily, but the interesting thing to me is, in the go back 5-6 years ago, the Windows Auto Run, you could just stick a thumb drive in,
and it would load
as
software,
a regular storage device, and you could potentially compromise a machine infected with malware. But a lot of Microsoft's done a lot to help prevent that, so that you can't really do that in modern versions of Windows as easily or at all, I don't think anymore. But this is like basically, once Microsoft shut this off, all the guys started to think, how can we come up with a new way to do this? Same kind of thing. How can I steal credentials or otherwise compromise the assets? So that's an interesting way that I hadn't thought about before. So.
Now, as processing power gets better, or maybe there's another way to do this, but the real soup to nuts attack would be you get this device, you plug it in, and either it calls home wirelessly or over a cell. This requires another device.
Right.
But you plug in as an Ethernet adapter, you get the creds you need, you somehow get them cracked either locally or across the network, and then your USB device, which was lying all the time and saying it was an Ethernet adapter, says, okay, I'm going to disconnect. I'm going to reconnect as a human interface device, a keyboard. and I'm going to hit the correct keys to log into Windows for you. Now that would be you plug it in, you wait a couple minutes, and you're physically into the box. That would be a heck of a thing.
Movies where they connect some device and the digits just start rolling through, and boom, they're in.
Right, exactly.
Usually in like less than 30 seconds.
I mean, I think it's achievable. I think it might take longer than, it's limited by the longer.
Password.
Exactly. It takes how long it takes to crack that password, but it's probably doable at this point.
Yeah.
That's
Interesting.
very clever. It's really, really clever. You can do man-in-the-middle attacks possibly too if you had some kind of like a network backend to this.
Right,
thing.
if you were piping the network traffic through there, sure.
Right, as opposed to just capturing it all. If you could actually let it go by and through or proxy it in some way.
Yeah, it's so clever.
You could.
I also got to wonder how many times you need to use a real USB to Ethernet device. I think most users probably won't encounter one.
Not anymore. It used to be popular like maybe a few years ago.
Well, with netbooks and the slim laptops, the ones that were, they're taking out of the hardware to make it the lightest laptop you can get, putting back that kind of functionality would require exactly one of those kinds of devices.
Right. All right, interesting. It's a good one to be aware of for sure, right? But hopefully you never run into that situation, and it sounds like this is more research than actual people practicing this type of thing.
It's only been out for about a week,
right.
but I think the Land Turtle, the guys at Hack5 have actually rolled a patch into their device to do the same attack automatically, so no one has to configure it. It just exists now.
Right, so in theory, if you wanted to, or if somebody wanted to, they could perhaps leverage this against you. So, but we always say, physical access to the device is basically it's game over. If I have physical access to the device, even for some small period of time, there's a much higher likelihood that I'm going to be able to compromise that than just having remote, connectivity to it in some way.
Sure.
Okay. So I think the last story before the internet weather is your weekly Mr. Robot Roundup. Now, I haven't seen the latest episode, but that's okay. I'm going to let you tell me about it.
I'll try not to spoil too much. I will try to focus only on the tech. Stan, if you want to go for a walk, I know you haven't seen the new season yet. It's up to you.
Well, I'll stay here, but I'll kind of doze off and zone out.
All right. Close your eyes and think about Ida. So one of the first things that caught my eye in this episode, or caught my ear, I suppose, is Elliot's in the car, and he doesn't have any of his hardware anymore. And he says to the guy who's driving the car, "We need to stop at Micro Center." And I was like, oh my God, because that's something that I think all the time. So Micro Center is a pretty cool store. I think it's one of the few stores you can go and buy.
It's like one of the few ones left where it's actually got like real computer equipment.
Yep.
Especially if you're like a home hobbyist, you want to build your own. They got a whole section for doing that kind of stuff. Anyway, I'm sorry.
And then they go to Micro Center, and it must be like the middle of the night. He's the only person there. But like if you've ever been to a Micro Center, you know what the signs look like. You know what the bins with the giant overflowing baskets of whatever it is you want to buy. I absolutely went to a Micro Center and filmed the scene there. So I was kind of excited because I really do like this store.
I wonder which one they did because they filmed that
in New York, usually.
In New York, New Jersey area. There is one, right by us.
Yep.
Anyway, so we're in New Jersey, but.
So it wasn't that one,
Okay.
but I'm sure they found one somewhere around New York.
Okay.
He picks up a can of Pringles, which for a second evaded me as to why he had bought a can of Pringles along with all this stuff. But then he goes home and he starts, cutting into the can and taking out cables and stuff, and he builds a cantenna, which was a very popular thing to do for a long time. Was if you couldn't afford yourself a real metal cantenna, you would buy a Pringles can, and you would do a little modification, a little bit of math, and you would build one. Now, he doesn't go ahead and do all of that. Like it's a little bit cheated. Like instead of, you're supposed to like make that pigtail wire and stick it into the can at a certain length from the opening and all that other stuff. Right. I think he just like puts the cable in and keeps the wireless card at the end of the cable, which isn't quite right. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if it would work. I imagine it wouldn't. But it was good enough for the show. So they fudged a little bit in my opinion, but the fact that they brought up the Pringles cantenna was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's kind of old school though.
Yeah, it is
an old school technique. And especially nowadays you can get much better antennas.
You can buy those at Micro Center. So I was like, so why would you do that? But another little thing, when he fires up that cantenna, one of the access points is "I did it for the lulz," which it's a phrase that has a bit of a hacker story behind it. He does do something really interesting and a little bit scary, is he fills out a form and he faxes it from a fake phone number to the police. And it's an exigent circumstances form, which allows him, apparently, to request information about a phone number, which you normally would not be able to get, as long as you have evidence that there's exigent circumstances. And the case that he uses is that someone is about to commit suicide. He needs to locate the person, so he calls up the police and says, I am this badge number, I have this situation, I need you to identify the location of the phone in order to identify this person so we can save their life, which is a complete fabrication, but apparently it works. So that was a little, in the show it works. Right. It's a little unnerving. I really don't know enough about it.
So there was social engineering really going on there.
Absolutely. So he had a badge number, and he was speaking the lingo well enough that he convinced the person on the other end that he was a police officer and that he was making a legitimate request for this information. So, like I said, a little unnerving.
Right.
But that was probably the creepiest thing of the episode, but he does get what he wants eventually. He uses Spokio, which I think we've talked about, they've mentioned on the show before, which is sort of like a people search site.
Right.
And he's able to locate who he's looking for. And the one question I had that I didn't know the answer to was, Darlene makes a reference to a hackerspace on Canal Street. And I don't know that there actually is one in New York City there, but it would be a really good place to have one, because Canal Street is known for having electronic shops, and you can get all sorts of crazy stuff from the very cheap bins on Canal. So it's not accurate to the real world, but somebody thought about where you would put one.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that was kind of cool.
Interesting. Okay.
And I think I managed to not spoil too many plot points.
Yeah, I'm still
okay, good.
Awesome.
Yeah, you really only talked about the tech, I think, and not the actual storyline. So I think I can still watch it and not really have
Well, I
too
think
much
I'm going to
spoiled.
enjoy it more now because of the
Now
commentary
you're right. Now you
provided.
can look
Now I'm
for
going
all
to be
these
looking for
things.
the cantenna done incorrectly.
I have noticed this season specifically, they have really been showing a lot of screens as part of and they'll have URLs or different things that they're showing, which are actually visitable.
Yes,
like
they are creating
real
this.
things out there on the internet you can go hit, and they bring up menus and interfaces.
And some of them are fun because, if you've watched the latest episode, there'll be some reference to something that's going on in the story. Like there was one of those pages had a little chat room in it. One of the characters is like, so what was the name of that FBI operation again? And if you enter it in because you've watched the episode, it continues on and tells you a little bit more.
Oh, interesting.
So I think it's sort of an Easter egg for people who are watching the show and want to go and test out all the things that they're seeing. You'll find stuff that's related and you'll get a bit more out of it.
There's a lot of little Easter eggs like that. Like there was another one, we probably already talked about this, where they had, Elliot has like his little journal. This is early on, maybe episode 2, and he's writing in his journal, and there was like
QR
a hand-drawn QR code,
Yep.
which I immediately scanned. I paused the TV and scanned it, and it does take you to somewhere. I can't remember what it was.
Technologies.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of little things like that they've put into the show to give, I guess, people who are really paying attention some extra things to go look at, kind of cool little side things to go look at, which is kind of fun. It's interesting, I think they've done a lot of things with this show that is really kind of tailored to the security, not only regular people to kind of get them into the spirit of it, but people who are really into it, give them a next level to go take it, kind of in a way.
And if you don't know anything about it, it gives you an excuse to start Googling everything you see on the show.
Right. Yeah, it's fun. Good show. So let's take a look at the Internet Weather Report for this week. And this is the top 10 most probed ports, and not any real big changes other than the 23 TCP has tailed down a little bit. And actually, I should have taken I don't think I put a chart together on this one, but I should have, only because there are some other more interesting charts. But we always talk about lots of scanning on 23 TCP telnet, a lot of these IoT devices involved in that behavior, basically going back to that story you had a little bit earlier with the SSH keys and SSL keys. But it has kind of tailed off a little bit, at least in terms of, again, it's way beyond everything else that's being scanned by a large margin, but it took a little pause, a little decrease there. 22 TCP SSH is also another remote access type of port that is often scanned for and brute force password guessed against. 53 UDP, this is probably them searching for other devices that they could use as part of DNS amplification attacks. 3389 TCP is your remote desktop protocol. That's another one that if you have remote desktop protocol open to the internet, you really should rethink your strategy because there's a lot of brute force activity going on against that as well. And that's all of your Windows devices for the most part. It's not on by default, but a lot of corporate desktops or anything that has like, what is it? Not the like the professional, I think, version of Windows has it as a potential option to be turned on. Mm-hmm. So something to be concerned about. You definitely don't want to have that open if you can avoid it. AD-TCP, scanning for web servers, 443 TCP, also HTTPS. And then you've got your 445 TCP, which is your Windows file sharing, SMB stuff. 1911 TCP is the...
Niagara?
Yes, Tritium, Niagara, Fox, building automation. This is probably benign, relatively speaking. Most of this activity, I would say, all, if not all, the majority of it is coming from, there's a couple of these guys out there who scan the internet to kind of get a good kind of census of what's going on and what ports are open and whatnot. So they're doing it for benevolent purposes to kind of get a good assessment of what's out there and what is open so that other good guy defenders like ourselves and whatnot can go look at those reports and say, hey, I want to make sure I don't have any of these and I can close them down or whatnot. But that's an interesting service. We've seen that being scanned quite a bit, and there is some of that out there. And it's mostly for, I don't even know, it's like for automation of building processes, things that...
Like HVAC?
Yeah, like your HVAC, and I think even like lights and other things can be controlled by that. And then 123 UDP is NTP, also, again, usually being used for amplification attacks most often. So then let's go take a look at the most sources probing. I always say this one's a lot more interesting to me because you've gotten a whole bunch of devices scanning certain ports at the same time or in unison, which is usually indicative of a botnet type activity. So 23 TCP, obviously, again, still the lion's share of the activity here in terms of the number of sources scanning. It's, again, less than it was before, because I think the last time we looked at it, you know, the little Pac-Man, it was a little bit more closed, the mouth. He's like on an open, wide open mouth position at this point. So it's a little bit down. It's still way more than everything else. The 445 TCP is the next number 2 slot. The other one that I would point out in here that is interesting, I think, is the 2323 TCP. So this actually moved up 709 positions, and we'll take a look at that chart. That's a pretty steep climb, and we'll talk about why that one might have gone up so dramatically, as well as who's behind it, or at least some inkling of maybe who behind it. AD-TCP, not much news there. That's more web scanning. And then you got some BitTorrent that kind of gets in here, 6881 UDP. That may or may not be, you know, the way BitTorrent works. They kind of, it looks like scanning, but it might not necessarily be. They're just trying to find peers. 4028 TCP, I got a chart on this one as well. This is that one that I'm still kind of on the fence. The Hydra, Light Hydra botnet family, it's a Linux-based piece of malware, similar to stuff that gets dropped onto these IoT devices. For some period of time, at least maybe a couple of years ago, they were using 4028 TCP to some degree for their command and control operations, but I don't really understand to what degree. We'll take a look at a chart on that as well. And it might be a little bit clearer, but it's still, I don't have any concrete evidence. And then 3389 TCP is also in there again, remote desktop protocol. So you always see, I'm kind of surprised SSH isn't in here. However, maybe 2323 TCP kind of knocked it off the top 10. It's probably down there in the top 20 somewhere. I'd have to go look. So this is the 2323 TCP. You can see it went from pretty much relative obscurity of nobody looking for this to all of a sudden people really starting to look for it. It looks, there might have been like a little probe of scan flows from maybe one source or hardly any sources back around the August 23rd time frame, which might be interesting. And then it started to creep up here until it reached quite a peak here of about 90 million scan flows per hour with a number of scan sources around 12,000, which is not, it's not a huge number compared to the 23 TCP stuff we see, which is in the hundreds of thousands, but still it's pretty decent. When I looked at the, so part of our telemetry we get based on this report data is I can look and get like a listing of all the scan sources that are involved in this activity. So I did that, I got a list of all the source IPs, and just taking like a handful of them, punching them into Shodan, lots of them came back as these Dahua DVRs. So it looks like a lot of them are, identified as that type of IoT device. There were a couple other IoT things in there, but it seemed like just randomly picking some, I was getting that a lot. And I probably looked at maybe 20 out of 20,000 or whatever it was, or whatever, 10,000. They're definitely, whoever's behind it is using probably the similar toolkit to whatever the 23 TCP scanning is. Oh, and I should probably point out, and we didn't talk about this, why are people scanning 2323 TCP? So this is an alternate port for Telnet. 23 TCP is Telnet. So 2323 TCP has been used as an alternate Telnet port. There has been used a little bit more, I think, with Cisco, especially Cisco routers. So there might be some corollary with that, where people are seeking out those types of devices with respect to Telnet. We know that there have been some recent vulnerabilities with Cisco devices. The shadow brokers, I think one of you guys probably covered it. You probably did, right? They have a couple of vulnerabilities for Cisco devices, so it might be related to that. However, it is a botnet that's behind this scanning. It's a lot of devices, a lot of these, like I said, the Dahua DVR. So, it's not like a single actor trying to scan the internet at large. He's got a bunch of bots doing it, trying to collect up however many there are on there. And to what end? Probably trying to get remote access, just like it would for Telnet. But something to keep in mind, if you have devices, you should really know what services you're exposing to the internet. We talk about this all the time. And certainly, if you have Telnet exposed, don't. Try to use SSH. If you have this Telnet exposed on this port, it's not helping any. You're not hiding it from anybody, basically, is the story behind that. Just moving it to another port that you think people aren't looking for doesn't necessarily prevent people from finding it, believe me. So also I would say filter and restrict access to these services if you can, to only network ranges that should need to connect to it. Don't expose it to the internet.
But I was going to say, if you can set up a VPN, that also might be a better way of doing it. Instead of putting it directly on the internet, if you can put it behind a VPN gateway and require that you log in before you even talk to the service, what helps?
Yes, right. That's a good point as well. And most of these Cisco devices, assuming that that's what most of this is about, support VPN as a method of connectivity to do that sort of thing. So the next one that I did pull a chart on is this 4028 TCP. This is DT server port, which I think is probably, actually I should probably go look it up. I didn't. I'm assuming it's related to some kind of BitTorrent thing, just based on the name of DT server. When I looked at the types of devices involved in this scanning behavior, and you could see that this is definitely botnet related, because you see lots of activity, and then you kind of see that sawtooth waveform where it goes off, and then they're going again. And then recently here, back in like September 4th, it kind of skittered down again in this sawtooth waveform, and then went up again. When I looked at this, again, it's a lot of these IoT devices. I saw, again, I just took the IPs, ran them through Shodan to try to see what do they have them. And a lot of times they'll have like the banner page, in the Shodan data to tell you what it was. So I see a lot of AirOS routers. I see a lot of MikroTik routers. So same types of devices again. All these IoT devices, people just put them on the internet, and they're probably not changing the passwords to something other than what the default is. So somebody's compromised it, and now they put some malware on there. Beating a dead horse or wherever, a drum, if you have devices like this at home or on your network, you should really make sure that it's not exposed to the internet. And you should not use default passwords. And it's probably a good practice to reboot your home router every now and then if you can. I would encourage that, because
I remember growing up, I had to. It was one of those older little blue ones that every once in a while it started acting funny and you'd have to reboot it anyway. But
maybe those were getting hacked too.
Yeah, might be.
I have no way to prove one way or the other, but I tend to think it might have been.
Yeah, if you're watching the program and every once in a while your home router, like your network connection and connectivity to the internet goes to heck, and you're like so slow, and then when you reboot it, everything's better again, and you're using the default password on your router of password or admin, you might want to change that. And maybe it won't get clogged up again like that. Because what happens is it gets infected, and now it starts doing all this scanning, and it's too busy scanning the internet, doing bad guy stuff, to actually help you get to Google or wherever you're trying to go to. So something to consider. And then the last one that we have here, which was not on the chart, but we did have a pretty significant spike in activity, and we've seen this before, is we're seeing scanning on 1720 TCP H.323. You can use this is kind of, it's similar to SIP for doing call setup for VoIP, but I don't know how much, I mean, SIP has really kind of been it's kind of like the Betamax and VHS kind of thing. SIP is VHS, everybody went that route. But H.323 was around probably before SIP, I think, and it was used for the similar type of purposes. And there's a lot of devices that still support that, especially for video conferencing. I know that there's a lot of H.323 that comes into play. Primarily, we're only seeing a very few number of sources really involved in this scanning activity. There's 2 in the Netherlands and 1 in Lithuania. So in these other ones, we're talking about thousands and tens of thousands of sources scanning. This is just 3 guys that we're seeing. But it accounts for about 45 to 50 million at peak scan flows per hour that they're involved in. So they're pretty aggressively looking for these types of devices. I would venture to guess, if it was me and I was scanning for 1720 TCP, I'm probably trying to get into VoIP PBXs or other types of VoIP stuff so that I can maybe try to engage in toll fraud, international revenue share fraud type activities, things like that. That's just a hunch based on experience. So something to be aware of, especially if you have PBXs or other VoIP infrastructure connected to the internet. Maybe you're protecting the SIP interface really well, but maybe you're not, or not even aware that you're exposing the H.323 on your asterisk PBX server or whatever. So you might want to double check that and make sure that you know what's being shared and exposed to the internet, because they might not be coming in the expected path that you would expect. That's the show for today, though. Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at attThreatTraq@list.att.com. You can find the AT&T ThreatTraq program on the AT&T Tech channel. It's also on YouTube and iTunes. And please follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATTBusiness. I'd like to thank you, Matt.
Sure.
Thanks, Stan, for joining us today. I'm John Hogoboom. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.